Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm Matthew King. Here's my faithful assistant Loki, who's helping me to present today's discussion about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Before we get going, please like and subscribe if you really like it.
Do you really like it?
And also really consider becoming a patron if you're interested in that, because we could do with as much financial support as possible. So we really appreciate the generosity of our current audience and our patrons, but we could do with more in order to keep producing the content that we're producing. Today's video is about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and the reason why I want to talk about Beethoven's Ninth is primarily because this month, and this is being shot in May 2024, this is the month of the 200th anniversary of the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in 1824 at a theatre called the Theater am Kärntnertor in Vienna. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, so Viennese people can correct my pronunciation, but you can see a picture of it. So this was the location, and there's a context that I need to give you. And then after the context, we're going to look at the beginning of the symphony. And if you really like what you hear in the video, then I'll do more. I'm not going to do the whole symphony. I'm not even going to do the whole of the first movement. I'm not even going to do the whole of the exposition of the first movement. We'll just look at the opening today. And then if you like it, we'll sort of turn it into a soap opera and go on to the next bit and then the next bit and see what happens. But it seems in the 200th anniversary, it's a fun time to get into this piece, really get inside it and find out what the hell is the Ninth Symphony. It's an iconic piece in terms of the history of Western music, but what is it and why is it celebrated? So these are all the questions that I'm going to start trying to understand. So the premiere in 1824 followed a long period, a sort of hiatus in Beethoven's career. Let me give you a bit of a background. He'd become very, very famous in his 20s as a pianist and improviser of incredible skill, and everyone, particularly his aristocratic patrons, but also members of the music-loving public in Vienna, and he wasn't Viennese, he originally came from Bonn in West Germany, but he'd travelled as a young man to Vienna because it was the city of Mozart and Haydn, and he knew it was the cultural hub of Western Europe, and he remained in Vienna till the end of his life. He died in Vienna in 1827, age 56, which is the same age as I am now. So he was 56 when he died, which by modern standards is terribly young. The Ninth Symphony comes pretty close to the end of his career in 1824 when he was 53. And he was writing it for a couple of years prior to that. But the context, just to go back to what I was saying, he'd established himself in his 20s as a prodigious improviser and pianist, and as the composer of primarily piano sonatas. He'd written about 15 piano sonatas before the turn of the century, so he was a hugely accomplished and brilliant pianist and composer of piano music. But then he'd begun to establish himself as a composer of other genres, string quartets in his 20s, other lovely chamber pieces in his 20s, and then symphonies. The first symphony was written just on the cusp of the 19th century, and then he sort of established himself in what's now known as his middle period with these big symphonies, and they got bigger and bigger and more grand and epic. And this middle period, as it's known, the grand part of his career in his 30s, it really kicks off around 1800, really gets going with the Eroica Symphony of 1803. And it culminates in terms of his career in 1808, when he gave an absolutely monstrous concert at the Theater an der Wien in Vienna. And it was very, very cold. I think it was December. The audience was sort of huddling in their fur coats, trying to keep warm. And they listened to the Fifth Symphony, the glorious and iconic Fifth Symphony, and also the Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral. So the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies were premiered together. I believe they were given opposite numbers. In other words, the Pastoral was called the Fifth, and what we know as the Fifth was called the Sixth. And they were clearly presented as a sort of polar opposites. One fierce and full of destiny and minor key and turbulent, and the other peaceful, pastoral, somehow profound, elevated. So these two things held in marvellous kind of balance. And in that concert, parts of his new Mass in C were performed. He improvised at the piano. Even though he was going deaf, he was still a brilliant performer. At the end of the concert, I mean, imagine how long this must have gone on. At the end, he then performed a new piece called the Choral Fantasia, where he sat at the piano and played this tune. I'm improvising that. So those of you who know the piece very well may have noticed that that's not an absolutely faithful depiction of it, but it's broadly speaking that. And do you notice the similarity of that tune with the Ninth Symphony theme? So this Choral Fantasia began as a piano solo, then the orchestra joined in. It was a set of variations, or it's a kind of fantasia that then becomes a set of variations, and then at the end voices come in and sing about the greatness of music and how it's a kind of gift of the gods. And that was the end, the grand finale of the concert in 1808. And the fascinating thing is that that grand conception of a piece with Beethoven as soloist, an orchestra, that tune and the chorus coming in is really a prototype for what he did in 1824 when the Ninth Symphony was performed. So do you see how the two concerts in his life are representative of him in a sense? 1808, when he's at the height of his powers, presenting this big concert with the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies and then finishing with the Choral Fantasia. And then kind of a return in 1824 with the Ninth Symphony, which does something sort of similar and ends with this blaze of glory with the same tune or very similar tune and a kind of grand thing, but grander than the Choral Fantasia. So these two concerts are really important to bear in mind because in between there'd been years of real struggle for Beethoven, increasing deafness, increasing depression because he was becoming more and more hermit-like in his life. He wanted to get married but couldn't find an appropriate partner. After all, he was, as one woman described, half mad. He was an eccentric guy, living really in his work, living through his work in a sense. His life, such as it was increasingly sort of eccentric. And then in the sort of teen years of the 19th century, between 1813 and 1818, he wasn't composing a great deal. He was drinking too much. He was becoming increasingly deaf. He was losing some confidence in his creative powers. And something very extraordinary happens, which is like a kind of a phoenix-like thing, where his middle period style kind of dies. And for a period, he isn't quite sure what to do between 1813 and 1815. He writes a couple of rather marvellous piano sonatas, but not much else, a couple of amazing cello sonatas. And gradually, a new style emerges, which we call the late period. And this is a style that's much more indebted to his study of older composers, particularly Bach and Handel, and really immersing himself in the great old genres of the Baroque era, particularly fugue, which becomes something that increasingly fascinates him. Then in 1818, he wrote this prodigious and monstrous and extraordinary piano sonata called the Hammerklavier Sonata. That was quickly followed by the last three piano sonatas. And it's like he's limbering up for his final huge sort of push of creativity. In the 1820s, he writes the Missa Solemnis, the biggest mass that had ever been composed and which he considered to be his masterpiece. Then he composed the Ninth Symphony. And then after that, he wrote these incredible string quartets, 5 great string quartets, and then he died. So we have that whole late flowering of his career. And in the great theatre concert of 1824, the bits of the Missa Solemnis were performed and the Ninth Symphony. So it was these two huge pieces that were performed side by side. And then, as you know, the Ninth Symphony ends with this incredible setting of Schiller's Ode to Joy, this great hymn to the brotherhood of humankind. Beethoven, deaf and irascible and hermit-like, is somehow reaching out with his arms to humanity and saying, you know, I embrace you. It's a very moving thing. And that's the end of the Ninth Symphony. But that's the end, and that's not what we're going to talk about right now, because everyone talks about the Ode to Joy, and I fully understand why. It's an extraordinary thing. But the Ninth Symphony is more than that. There are 4 movements. And what we're going to do now is discuss the beginning of the first movement, which is kind of extraordinary. It's this thing that Beethoven does which hadn't been done before. So the Ninth Symphony begins in a new kind of way. Beethoven always began his music in different ways. I think of all great composers, apart from Igor Stravinsky in the 20th century, I can't think of anyone who reinvented himself quite so thoroughly with every new piece. But Beethoven had this marvellous way of never repeating himself. You know, he never began a symphony like the Fifth, for example, never began another symphony like the Sixth, and so on. So every piece is unique. And you get to the Ninth Symphony, and what's so marvellous about it is it's like Beethoven returning to the symphonic genre after a gap of a decade and saying, okay, well, you thought you knew what I did in symphonies, but it's different now. And the symphony begins with this marvellous thing, which is an open fifth. And it's in D minor, but it's not, what you hear is not D minor. You hear an open fifth on A and E, which theoretically is therefore located on the dominant of D minor. But I mean, if you're listening to it, you don't necessarily, unless you've got perfect pitch, know that. But what you do hear is this sort of primal thing. The fifth is primal by its nature, because if you think of the harmonic series, well, you start off in the harmonic series with an octave. This is acoustics. But the first interval that you hear is the fifth. So there is something primal about it. It's like the most primitive interval. And it's also known as the perfect fifth, isn't it? Because it's sort of open and mysterious. It evokes some sort of sense of mystery, and it also evokes, yeah, some kind of beginning of the world feeling, you know? It's extraordinary. It's also like nothing else in the classical era. You know, Mozart didn't do this kind of thing. Haydn didn't do this, as far as I remember. I know he wrote a quartet called the Fifths Quartet, but this is different. This is just a tremolo. We've got these sort of sextuplet tremolos in the strings and the horns. And horns are very primal sounding instruments, if they want to be, aren't they? Because they're ancient. They hold that fifth. So you're held in a kind of primal mystery. And the fifths are now verticalized. In other words, they become a theme. Ba-da! We hear them in the violins and then the cellos and basses. So we hear these falling fifths and fourths, but basically we're hearing them going down the octaves. Marvellously compelling because we're hearing these dotted rhythms. Dotted rhythms were always, think of the Baroque period, think of the beginning of the Messiah, which Beethoven admired, Handel's Messiah. It has all these dotted rhythms. It's associated in the Baroque era with something kind of stern and regal, perhaps, something ceremonious. And you get that here in the Ninth Symphony. So there are these sort of stern rhythms outlining this mysterious interval. And then they increase in speed. And then they get decorated. Or they've developed these kind of echoing effects. And it's at this point that Beethoven introduces, in a very weird way, the D of the symphony. There it is, there's the D. But it's sort of a fourth. It's an unrealized interval. It doesn't feel as if it's rooted. And then suddenly, here's the main theme. Very, very assertive, extraordinarily kind of, I was going to say brutal, I don't know if that's quite the word, but it's stern, isn't it? It's imperious, it's got a kind of regal quality. Beethoven is, in a sense, and called himself this on occasion, the emperor of music. You know, here he is the one. And so he is announcing, but he's not the symphonic composer he used to be. There's something sterner, something more old-fashioned here. Beethoven, we often associate Beethoven with the origins of Romanticism in music, and rightly so, they are discernible in his work. But at the end of his life, I don't think he's really interested in being a romantic composer. In a sense, he's partly interested in going back to the past, to the great past of Bach, of counterpoint and of a much more strict style of composition. Of course, these things in Beethoven are mixed up. We've already heard these radical things, these fifths, these tremolos, these mysterious things, which so influenced Romantic composers. I mean, think of Bruckner. Of Bruckner's 9 symphonies, almost every one of them begins a bit like Beethoven's Ninth, in a kind of tremolando, with a sense of kind of primal mystery. So, of course, he's being romantic. But when the theme comes, this great arpeggio with these these kind of stern gestures and these dotted rhythms and so forth. There's something almost like a Bach French Overture about it. It's got that kind of feeling as well. I'll point you to another piece just a couple of years earlier, the beginning of Beethoven's last sonata had also begun with these ferocious sort of Baroque double dotted rhythms. So it's a feature of his late style. And so the theme goes on. So it doesn't stop with the cadence, it goes back up with chords this time. So we haven't really heard chords before. We've just heard a huge arpeggio and a unison. And then the chords, and then going to the subdominant, and then E flat, which is what we call the Neapolitan, typical of Beethoven, to bring this remote key relationship right in early. The key relationship of the Neapolitan E flat, remember the tonic is D, but suddenly you've got E flat, just a semitone above the tonic, then lands on the dominant, and then we get this tune, also double dotted. Offbeat, 1, 2, 1, 2. Now isn't that extraordinary? Beethoven's late style does all sorts of crazy things with rhythm, magnificent things with rhythm, where he breaks up your normal expectations, and this often happens at cadences. You get the feeling that at the end of his life, Beethoven was actually bored with conventional cadences. Because what he could have done, and sort of should have done according to the classical style, I'll just show you what this would probably conventionally do. You'd cadence normally. But what he does instead is second phrase, 2, 1, 2. He's got these 1, 2. Everything's on the second beat. And even that extraordinary, ferocious downward sweep from the first violins crosses the first beat, because it goes 1, 2, 1, 2, and it lands on 2. So it's got this marvellous sort of, in all its fury, it's also sort of oddly dislocated, as if it's no longer landing in the conventional position. And that makes it more interesting, doesn't it? It kind of fizzes with energy. You're not quite sure where you are. And as it lands, we go back into the tremolo, this time on the tonic. So this primal descent. And we're into our second sentence, if you like. We've heard a kind of sentence so far with the main theme. The main theme is this. And then the chords come in, the Neapolitan, and then this second, much more lyrical theme with these pedals, and then this bit, end of sentence, and here comes the second sentence, open fifths, and now it gets quicker. Do you hear that B flat coming in at the bottom suddenly? Everything was this. He kind of lifts that A to a B flat, and suddenly, second statement is B flat major. Lands on the D, which of course is the tonic of the piece. And this is where we go into something called a transition, because having hit that D, and then the woodwinds do these answer. I'm trying to play from Liszt's transcription here, which is pretty difficult. Those are the woodwinds. Back to the strings. This is the tutti, everyone doing this together, and the woodwind. Now we're going towards D major, and then the subdominant. And there we hit the dominant pedal, so this is the moment where we're on the move. And Beethoven introduces this wonderful oscillating sort of pedal note, and this slightly Baroque thing. restates it as a canon, so the basses go da 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 da, and then the trebles go. And then we're into this preparation for the second subject, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But that Baroque bit's very interesting. I've been talking a lot about Baroque models, Handel and Bach and so on. Let me show you something else. If you go to the end of the Fifth Symphony, which we've already mentioned from 1808, so more than a decade earlier, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but if you get to the end of the movement, you get this bit. Do you remember that bit? So that sort of... somewhat similar, so there's that sort of toccata-like style, almost like it's lifted out of a kind of Baroque, almost like just a sort of Baroque style. He just goes into the old style, the old, what would have been known in Beethoven's time as the learned style. And here he is going into it in a very similar way, actually. Do you see, with that pedal note and then the canon? Go to C7. Now, it has this wonderful modulation. So I'll go from the canon. The bass is dropping to C7. Now, we could have just stopped there and then gone into the next chord, you know, C7, and then dropping into F7, but he doesn't. He does this wonderful thing. He uses what jazz musicians would call a sort of tritone substitute. That G flat in the bass, G. What a wonderful harmonist he is when he wants to be. That's a beautiful transitional passage. Let me play it again. So I'll start the basses. D flat in the bass, there's C7, there's the G flat drop in the bass, there's a dominant minor ninth, and then we're ready to go into the, you know, it's a passage that passes very quickly. You just hear the strings kind of da 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 da, and you don't notice how rich and beautiful those chords are. And then going into this lovely other character, absolutely serene, with and pastoral actually, with these alternating woodwind and horns. We're out of the world of the stern first subject and now into this lovely pastoral world. And that's where we'll go in the next episode, the lovely pastoral atmosphere of the second subject. Beethoven is very good at this. He introduces one set of characters and then he introduces something very contrasting. So it's almost like it is a drama. It's building up a drama. These themes are characters, and the interplay that they have is just like a drama. It's like a play or like a story. So there we go. I hope that's been helpful. If you liked that little discussion about the opening of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, then please like and subscribe and maybe donate, as I said earlier in the video. Let me know in the comments whether you want to have a second episode, because if you do, we'll try and do that soon. Thank you for listening. Here is, in Liszt's arrangement, the opening of the Beethoven's Ninth, just played straight.